I'm Nora Bennett, 34, and the night my life tilted began with a stack of repair slips and a cup of coffee that had gone cold on my living room floor. Downstairs, a radiator knocked like it always does before a storm, and somewhere along the hallway someone laughed through a door, left slightly ajar. I had invoices open, and my grandmother's old ledger at my elbow, the paper soft from years of use when the doorbell rang once and then again, as if whoever was on the other side had no intention of waiting. The clock on the stove said 7:15, which meant this wasn't a delivery and it wasn't one of my tenants needing batteries for a smoke alarm. I stood up, smoothed my sweater by habit, and felt that old childhood tightness settle behind my ribs, a feeling I hadn't named in years, but recognized the moment I felt it. Maple Terrace has a way of announcing trouble before it steps inside. I knew before I opened the door that Claire would be there with her perfect coat and a smile that never reached her eyes. I also knew that whatever she carried in that leather portfolio would be presented as what's best for the family, and that by the end of the night I would be asked to accept it without a word. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground, quietly tap like and subscribe, so this story finds the folks who need it. I grew up 2 miles from Maple Terrace in a small brown house with a chain-link fence and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee, where my grandmother Ruth kept the back door unlatched through every season because neighbors should never feel like strangers. She worked the property with a ledger in one hand and a basket of muffins in the other, and when I was little she let me help post notices on the bulletin board in the lobby showing me how to tape the corners so they wouldn't curl in the summer heat. My parents believed in effort and appearances in equal measure. My father ironed his shirts even on Saturdays, and my mother polished the silver before company came, but it was Ruth who shaped the parts of me that stuck. Keep your word count. What matters? Look people in the eye when you speak. Claire was 3 years older and fast-tracked from the start, the kind of student teachers call promising the kind of daughter neighbors brag about at church. I was a steady child who noticed leaky hoses and the way Mr. Hollis on the 3rd floor shuffled when the pain in his hip flared. I liked lists, clean hallways, and hearing someone's relief when a problem got fixed. When Claire left for law school, the house felt louder in her absence, as if our conversations expanded to fill the space she used to command. She sent glossy postcards from city skylines and summer internships, all steel and shine, while I took classes in facility management and shadowed Ruth on weekends learning boiler rooms before I learned balance sheets. By the time Claire made partner, she'd learned to speak in numbers that sounded like weather reports, percentages, projections, storms you could plan for and capitalize on if you stood in the right place. I learned something smaller, and to me more durable, which windows gather frost first, where to set salt before an ice warning, how to spot the bowed ceiling that means water has been hiding for weeks. At family dinners, my parents applauded Claire's closings and shook their heads over my scuffed work boots, wiping at non-existent dirt on the table as if it might spread. No one meant harm, or at least that's what I told myself. Still, there are patterns you feel long before you name them, and favoritism lives quietly when everyone pretends it isn't there. After Ruth passed, the house felt quieter in a different way, and Maple Terrace carried her absence like a draft under a door you can't quite seal. I kept showing up new air filters. A railing tightened the inevitable late-night call about a fuse that popped, and the tenants kept living, which is the only proof a building like ours ever needs. Claire stepped in at the memorial with a binder that looked heavier than the flowers, telling my parents she would streamline the portfolio, a phrase that left me nodding and uneasy. She chose bigger earrings and sharper shoes and talked about best use and market pressure, her words floating across the dining room like a language I didn't speak. I answered maintenance calls on the porch pencil tucked behind my ear, trying not to overhear decisions about properties that had names before they had numbers. In the months that followed, my parents leaned on Claire's confidence, the way some folks lean on a banister, not noticing when it gives a little under their weight. On the night the doorbell rang, I had been toggling between emails and handwritten notes, the kind Ruth would have preferred even if the ink smudged on humid days. The hallway smelled faintly of the chicken soup Edith Parker had carried upstairs an hour earlier for Lila Peterson, who'd caught a winter cough that lingers when the weather can't decide what it wants to be. I thought of the way Manny Rivera waved through the lobby that afternoon, his hands still stained with the oil from fixing someone's dying vacuum, and I felt a tug of something like pride for this place that isn't pretty, not really, but knows what it is. Claire's footsteps sounded like they always have, crisp and decided, and when I opened the door, she stepped inside as if she owned the air. She looked around the room the way some people look at hotel art and asked how I'd been in a tone that suggested the answer was a formality. Her portfolio rested against her hip like a prop you don't forget on stage, and she held it a little higher when she mentioned a recent family review I hadn't known about. I invited her to sit, and she didn't, which told me the visit would be quick and not at all simple. She glanced at the maintenance slips at Ruth's ledger on my coffee table, at the mug with a chip near the handle that I hadn't noticed until she noticed everything. We had been children at the same table once, competing over the last slice of pie with gestures too polite to be called pushing, and now here we were, grown women in the doorway of a building our grandmother had kept with 2 hands and a strong back. Claire's gaze landed on the photo of Ruth. I keep by the window, the one with her arm around me on the roof at sunset, and for a second something softer flickered across her face, gone as quickly as it came. She opened the portfolio with a quiet click and slid an envelope across the table toward me, the paper thick, the edges too sharp like a snowfall that hides ice underneath. I didn't pick it up right away. I watched the way Claire's jaw tightened and released a rhythm I recognized from every award ceremony where my name hadn't been called. The radiator knocked once, hard enough to make us both glance toward the wall, and downstairs, a door opened and closed. Somewhere in the building, someone set a kettle on to boil. I finally reached for the envelope and felt the weight of it in my palm, the way a letter can feel heavier than it should when the news inside insists on being carried. Claire's voice was even when she said, "It's time," and there was no strain in her smile when she added that the numbers were fair. I slid a finger under the seal and, without looking at the page, knew that whatever came next had been decided without me. The envelope Claire slid across the table felt heavier than it should have. I opened it slowly, the paper stiff and unfamiliar under my hands. The numbers jumped from the page before I had even read the whole notice. My rent was set to rise from $2,350 a month to over $7,000. I read it again to be sure, but the numbers didn't change. The words blurred for a moment before coming back into focus, black letters on white paper, spelling out a decision already made without me. Claire's voice carried no warmth as she explained it was fair market value. She said it like she was doing me a favor, as though kindness were in the delivery rather than the demand. She adjusted her gold watch as she talked, letting the light catch on the face, and I heard her repeat the phrase that always followed her victories. Business is business. I asked her when this decision had been made. She looked at me with a shrug that dismissed the question before she even answered. The family had met the weekend before at my parents' house. "You should come more often," she said, almost like a tease, but her tone carried the sharpness of a knife. Important choices were made, she reminded me, and I had chosen not to be there. I pictured the dining room table with 14 of my relatives around it, my chair empty while Claire guided the conversation without interruption. The silence from that night returned to me in waves, the way my mother redirected talk to safer subjects, the way my father poured wine before anyone could argue, the way cousins glanced at one another without ever meeting my eyes. I remembered it then with a clarity that stung. They had all known. They had all chosen not to speak. I folded the notice carefully, though my hand shook, and placed it back in the envelope. My voice sounded steadier than I felt when I told Claire I'd have to review it with an attorney. She laughed at the suggestion, the sound sharp and short. "What lawyer would waste time on this?" she asked, her coat already draped over her arm. "The building's mine. The papers were signed last month." Her words dropped into the air like stones in water rippling outward. I couldn't find the breath to answer. It wasn't just my apartment she wanted, and we both knew it. It was my home, the tenants I cared for, and every connection that tied me back to Ruth. Mrs. Parker and 2B, who baked cookies each Christmas, Manny, who kept spare tools in his truck just in case, and Lila, who had lived in the building longer than I had been alive. Claire's smile wasn't about rent. It was about removing me from the one piece of our grandmother's world that still felt like mine. When the doorbell rang again, it wasn't Claire leaving. It was Edith Parker carrying her favorite teapot on a tray. Her cardigan sleeves rolled to her elbows. She stepped inside as if she had every right to be there, and in truth, she did. She had been Ruth's closest friend for 50 years. She had watched us grow up, had watched me walk these halls long after Claire stopped visiting. She set the teapot down and glanced once at the envelope still resting on the table. I heard enough, she said, her voice calm but firm. Claire's polished smile faltered just for a second before she recovered. Edith straightened her shoulders, all 5'2" of her standing tall in my doorway. I knew your grandmother longer than you were alive, Claire. I know what she would say about this. Claire didn't answer. She closed her portfolio with deliberate care, adjusted her coat, and walked out without another word. The door shut quietly, but the weight of it echoed long after she was gone. Edith poured tea into 2 cups with steady hands, the steam curling between us. Some battles take planning, not shouting, she told me, passing me one of the cups. The chamomile smell wrapped around us like a blanket, soft but strong. Her eyes lingered on the envelope, then shifted back to me. Your grandmother faced people like this her whole life. She taught me how to handle them. And she taught you too, even if you don't realize it yet. I wanted to argue that I wasn't ready, that Claire had already won, but the words never left my mouth. Instead, I looked at the cardboard box by the couch, the one I had been avoiding since Ruth's funeral. Inside were her files, the papers she had kept in her handwriting, the records she had trusted me to sort. My throat tightened as I thought of what might be waiting there. 2 days later, I pulled the box out and set it on the table. Dust rose in the sunlight as I opened the lid and lifted the first folder. Bank statements, property deeds, typed notes with Ruth's signature at the bottom. Each page told a story I hadn't heard before. I found an email printed and filed away, one Claire had sent to a development firm just weeks after Ruth's funeral. Once we secure full control of Maple Terrace conversion to luxury condos can begin. Initial estimates project a 300% return within 18 months. My hands shook as I read the date again. 2 weeks. That's how long it had taken her to start dismantling what Ruth had built. Folder after folder revealed more. The lake house Ruth had once said she wanted me to have was sold off with little discussion. My parents had signed their approval without hesitation. Claire had argued market conditions favored liquidation, and they had nodded along. Cousin Amy's inheritance promised as the old family shop had been rerouted into expansion Claire managed. A vacation property in Maine gone into another fund. Even retirement contributions for employees who had worked decades for our family were folded into projects Claire controlled. Edith came by as I spread the papers across the living room floor. She carried sandwiches and another pot of tea. Her eyes widened as she saw the records. I told her in a quiet voice that Claire's rent hikes weren't just for me. She was targeting every senior tenant, raising their rents to numbers they could never afford. Lila's rent would leap past $5,000. Another family's would double overnight. It wasn't just business, it was deliberate removal. Edith set down the tray and sat beside me. "Don't worry about me," she said, though I could hear the weight in her voice. "What else did you find?" I held up a slip of paper in Ruth's familiar cursive. It read, "Maple Terrace must remain in the family. The legacy must be protected." I felt the paper warm against my fingers, almost like Ruth's hand was on mine again. More and more a pattern appeared. Small transfers, adjustments to documents, quiet changes made while everyone looked elsewhere. Ruth had seen it too, I realized. She wasn't just kind in asking me to help with her finances near the end, she was preparing me. All those afternoons, balancing repair costs, learning to read tax records, helping her keep track of tenant promises, she had been teaching me the tools I would need now. I leaned back against the couch, my vision swimming. Every holiday where Claire's triumphs were celebrated while my work was dismissed played again in my mind. Every time I announced good news, only for my mother to redirect conversation. Every time my father praised Claire's smallest victory with pride he never extended to me. I whispered that I had been blind, but Edith shook her head. "Not blind," she said softly, "just trusting. There's a difference. I began stacking the papers into piles. Financial misconduct, tenant mistreatment, ownership transfers, patterns of timing. Each file told another piece of the same story. Claire always struck when people were vulnerable after a death, after an illness, after a setback no one could control. I could see it clearly now. She was clever, yes, but predictable. And predictable meant she could be challenged. My phone buzzed. Claire's name filled the screen. I let it ring once before I answered on speaker. Her voice came quick and sharp. "You have 1 week," she said. "Decide by then. I've been generous, even giving you notice." I told her I needed more time, but she cut me off. "There's nothing to review. Mom and Dad agree. The decision is made." Almost as if on cue, a text from my mother came through. "Your sister has carried us financially for years. We owe her." I stared at the screen long after the call ended. In another folder, I found more clues. Claire's firm had lost a major case. Her mortgage was stretched thin. Her cards carried balances she couldn't meet. It wasn't just greed pushing her. It was desperation. That made her dangerous, but it also made her exposed. A final text arrived from my father. "Family meeting next Sunday. Finalize arrangements. Be there." I folded the papers one by one and placed them back in the box. My hands no longer trembled. Edith stood, her voice steady. "You need Walter Haynes." I looked up confused until she explained. He was Ruth's personal attorney, the only one she trusted completely, even after retirement. Edith promised to call him, and I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Ruth's words in that letter once again. 1 week. That's how long I had before everything was decided. Edith's call to Walter set everything in motion. By the next morning, I was sitting across from him in his study, the room filled with books stacked high on dark wooden shelves. The air smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. Walter had thinning gray hair and a voice that carried the steadiness of someone who had argued more cases than I could count. He listened carefully as Edith explained what Claire had done, and when she finished, he leaned back and folded his hands together. "Ruth prepared for this," he said, speaking slowly, as though every word needed weight. He pulled out a folder from his desk and placed it in front of me. My name was written across the front in Ruth's handwriting. My chest tightened as I opened it. Inside were legal papers showing that 3 years earlier, Ruth had moved funds into a private trust forming Harbor Lane Holdings, LLC. With that, she had transferred Maple Terrace out of the family's general trust and into my hands, naming me manager and owner through the company. The words blurred as I tried to understand what I was reading. Walter explained it, with patience guiding me through the signatures and stamps. Ruth had made sure the papers were filed properly with the county, but Claire had never noticed. She had simply assumed she controlled everything after Ruth's passing, never checking to see what had actually been recorded. I traced my finger across my grandmother's signature on the deed. For 3 years I had been the legal owner without knowing it. While Claire spoke as if she held the power, she had only been an unauthorized caretaker, collecting rent and ignoring repairs without rightful authority. A strange mix of disbelief and relief washed over me. Ruth had seen far ahead, and she had built a safety net that only now revealed itself. Walter slid a second envelope toward me, also in Ruth's handwriting. Inside was a short note. "Don't chase approval. Build your own ground." Her words felt alive, written for me to find exactly in this moment. For the first time since Claire had stood in my doorway with that eviction notice, I felt the weight begin to shift. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Edith stopped by with signed statements from tenants about ignored maintenance requests and sudden rent increases. Manny offered to testify about times he had been turned away when repairs were needed, even as Claire charged extra management fees. I walked the halls with my phone, taking pictures of peeling paint water stains in the laundry room and pipes in the basement that should have been replaced years ago. Each detail was added to the growing pile of evidence Walter helped me organize in neat boxes. At night, I sat at my kitchen table sorting through the documents Ruth had kept. Every page seemed to carry her touch, every margin note a reminder of her care. She had been preparing me for years without my realizing it, teaching me to keep records, to notice the details, to stand on facts rather than feelings. But the silence in my apartment at night made it harder. I thought of family dinners where my achievements were brushed aside while Claire's smallest victories drew applause. I remembered the Thanksgiving where I mentioned being promoted to building manager, only to have the conversation turned immediately to Claire's new car. The pattern was clear now. They had never expected me to be more than the quiet one who filled in the gaps. One evening my parents appeared at my door without warning. My mother's pearls glinted under the hall light as she stepped inside, her eyes sweeping across the piles of papers on my table with disapproval. My father stood behind her, his voice carrying that tone I knew too well. "Claire tells us you're threatening legal action," he said. "You're tearing the family apart." I told them plainly that Claire had diverted more than $80,000, meant for maintenance, into her own accounts. My mother's gaze faltered, but she shook her head. "Business is complicated, Nora," she said softly. "Your sister understands these things better than you." The familiar sting of dismissal settled in my chest, sharper because of how natural it sounded from her lips. My father placed his hands in his pockets, silent but firm in his agreement. They left after urging me to reconsider, promising to talk sense into Claire. Their footsteps down the hall echoed long after the door closed. I sat back at the table staring at Ruth's notes. It was clear now that approval from my parents would never come, no matter how strong the evidence. I whispered the words Ruth had told me years ago, words that now made sense in a new way. Connection outlasts power. The week passed quickly as the family meeting drew closer. Edith called each evening to check on me, her voice steady, even when mine wavered. "Patience," she reminded me. Ruth always said patience wins more than force. Still, I couldn't shake the tension from my shoulders. Claire was clever, and desperate people rarely surrender quietly. On Sunday evening, I dressed carefully and drove to my parents' Tudor-style house. The driveway was already full, cars lined along the street headlights, cutting across the lawn as relatives arrived. I carried the box of documents Walter had prepared for me, the leather strap tight in my hand. Inside, the dining room was lit by the chandelier I remembered from childhood, crystal catching light and throwing sharp patterns across the glossy table. 14 relatives sat in their places, silver dishes gleaming on the sideboard. Claire stood at the head papers spread neatly before her, her blazer as crisp as her tone. "Tenant 3B is late on rent again," she announced, holding up an eviction notice. My parents sat beside her, nodding in support. She spoke of outdated units, costly maintenance, unreliable tenants, her voice steady as though every word was already agreed upon. For years, I would have stayed quiet, swallowing my protests. But Ruth's words and Walter's guidance echoed inside me. I set the box gently on the floor by my chair and raised my voice. "I've reviewed those records with my attorney," I said. The room fell silent. Claire's smile froze and her eyes narrowed. "What attorney?" she asked, her voice clipped. Almost on cue, the doorbell rang. My father stood to answer it, confusion tightening his brow. When he returned, Walter walked in behind him, his leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Recognition flashed across my mother's face as she realized who he was. I stood, my heart pounding, and introduced him clearly. "This is Walter Haynes, legal counsel for Harbor Lane Holdings." Murmurs broke around the table as Walter set his portfolio down and began to speak. Claire's confidence faltered for the first time, her fingers tightening on the edge of her papers. My cousins leaned forward, trying to catch every word. My father's face flushed red while my mother stared at the documents as if they were written in a language she had never seen before. Walter opened the folder and placed the deed squarely on the table. "Maple Terrace was legally transferred to Harbor Lane Holdings 3 years ago," he explained. "Miss Bennett is the rightful owner and manager." The room erupted into confusion, voices, overlapping relatives whispering urgently to one another. Claire sank into her chair, her jacket too large around her shoulders, her polished mask slipping. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't read. In that moment, the silence I had carried for so long finally broke. I met Claire's eyes across the table, and for the first time she had nothing to say. The meeting dissolved into chaos, cousins questioning loyalties, aunts whispering about the papers, uncles tapping on phones for answers. But Walter's calm presence anchored me. As we left that house later that evening, Edith squeezed my hand. "Ruth would be proud," she said. "You've found your voice." Driving back to Maple Terrace, I knew this wasn't the end. Claire would not step aside quietly. But for the first time, I had shown her and everyone else that I was not powerless. And deep down, I knew the real fight was only beginning. The night after the family meeting, I barely slept. I kept seeing Claire's face at the table, her confidence faltering when Walter placed the deed in front of her. The image carried me through the silence of my apartment, though I knew it would not last. Claire never walked away from a fight. 3 mornings later, the call from Walter came just as I was pouring coffee. His voice was measured, but there was tension underneath. "She's filed an emergency motion," he said. Claire was challenging the formation of Harbor Lane Holdings, claiming Ruth had been mentally unfit when she signed the papers. The words landed heavily, though I had half expected them. Walter explained that the judge had scheduled an immediate hearing for the next morning. Everything we had built could be undone with a single ruling. By afternoon, the first newspaper headline appeared. A photo of Claire standing with my parents filled the front page. The article painted her as a dutiful daughter trying to correct mistakes her mother had made in her final years. My father was quoted saying they wanted what was best for both our daughters. My mother stood beside him in the picture, her eyes red as if she had been crying. It was the same image they had shown the world all my life: unity, sacrifice, and respectability, always in Claire's direction. That evening, my parents came to my apartment again. My father's expression was hard, the same one he used when I was a child, and he wanted silence. My mother's voice carried disappointment dressed as concern. "This has gone far enough, Nora," she said. "Your sister has always managed the family's assets. Let her handle this before you embarrass yourself." My father placed a hand on my shoulder, urging me to be reasonable. Their words pressed against me, heavy with the same pattern I had known for years. When they left, the apartment seemed quieter than before, the walls holding the echo of their dismissal. I gathered the files on my table and walked across the courtyard to Edith's unit. She had left her porch light on, as if she had known I would come. Her kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon, and photographs of her grandchildren lined the shelves. She poured tea while I explained what Walter had told me. "Eleanor knew this would happen," she said, using Ruth's first name the way only lifelong friends did. She reminded me of the records Ruth had insisted I keep, every repair logged, every conversation with tenants noted. "That's why she chose you," Edith said softly. "Not because it was easy, but because you were the one who would care enough to do it right." By the time I returned to my apartment, Walter was already there, his briefcase open on the table. He had brought additional documents, medical records, signed statements, tax filings. We spent hours sorting them into careful stacks, each one labeled for the judge's review. Edith joined us with a folder of her own. Inside were statements from tenants who had known Ruth in her last years. They wrote of her clarity, her conversations about the future of Maple Terrace, her insistence that the building remain a home rather than a commodity. The night stretched long. Walter reviewed my testimony with me again and again, his voice steady even as mine faltered. Around midnight, Edith sat quietly on the couch, her knitting needles clicking softly. I pulled an old photo album from the shelf, flipping, until I found the picture of Ruth and me on the rooftop garden when I was 12. She had her arm around my shoulders, both of us looking out at the horizon. I traced her smile with my finger and whispered that I hoped I would make her proud. Morning came too soon. I sat in the courtroom, gripping the edge of the wooden table, my knuckles pale. The benches were full, every seat taken by tenants from Maple Terrace. Lila sat near the front with her cane, Manny stood along the wall, and even the Johnsons, who rarely left their apartment, had come holding hands. Edith sat beside me, her presence grounding me. Across the aisle, Claire was a picture of composure in her charcoal suit, her attorney at her side. My parents sat directly behind her, my father's arm across my mother's shoulders. The judge entered, and the room quieted. Claire's attorney, a man with a polished voice and practiced confidence, rose to speak first. He painted Ruth as frail and confused, arguing that I had taken advantage of her declining health. He held up medical prescriptions, twisting them into evidence of impairment. My stomach tightened as he spoke, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. When it was Walter's turn, he stood calmly and introduced himself as Ruth's counsel for over 3 decades. He spoke of her clarity, her attention to detail, and the foresight with which she established Harbor Lane Holdings. Then he opened his briefcase and set a tablet on the table. Rather than speak for Mrs. Bennet, he said, "I will let her speak for herself." The screen flickered, and Ruth's face appeared. The date stamp showed it was 3 weeks before she passed. Her voice filled the courtroom steady, though aged. "I, Ruth Bennet, being of sound mind and body, make this statement freely and without coercion." She spoke of Maple Terrace, of building it with my grandfather more than 50 years earlier. She explained why she wanted me to manage it, why she trusted me to continue her legacy. Each answer she gave to Walter's questions was deliberate, her mind sharp, her intention clear. The room fell silent when the video ended. Walter presented supporting documents, medical evaluations, confirming Ruth's mental fitness, signed reports from her physician, and detailed notes Ruth had kept about her decision. He followed with financial records, showing Claire's mismanagement, including more than $80,000 diverted from maintenance into personal accounts. Edith rose then, clutching her folder, and addressed the judge directly. She spoke of winters when the heat failed under Claire's watch, of elderly tenants who became sick of promises Ruth had made about security and dignity. The judge listened intently, then turned her gaze to me. "Miss Bennet," she said, "why do you believe you should continue control of Maple Terrace?" My walk to the stand felt longer than it was. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat. The judge repeated the question, and I steadied myself before answering. I told her I wasn't trying to punish anyone, only to protect what Ruth had built. I explained how I had been managing daily operations for years, how I knew every radiator that clanged in winter, every window that stuck in summer. I told her the tenants knew me, trusted me, and that I had no interest in turning their homes into numbers on a balance sheet. Claire's attorney pressed me with questions about finances, trying to expose gaps, but Walter had prepared me well. For every question, I had records, receipts, and plans. When the questioning ended, the judge called for closing arguments. Claire's attorney emphasized her professional training and the family's financial interests. Walter countered with Ruth's clear intentions, the supporting documents, and the testimony of those who lived under Claire's management. The judge took her time reviewing her notes in silence while the courtroom held its breath. Finally, she looked up. She ruled that Harbor Lane Holdings had been formed legally and that Ruth was competent when she transferred the property. She upheld my ownership and management rights. She went further, ordering a full accounting of all finances during Claire's tenure and repayment of any misused funds. Claire's composure slipped, her shoulders slumping even as she tried to maintain her expression. The gavel struck the sound sharp and final. Relief swept through the room like a tide. Edith gripped my hand, her eyes shining. Tenants stood and clapped softly, their voices rising in murmurs of thanks. Walter placed a steady hand on my shoulder and whispered. She knew exactly what she was doing. At the edge of the crowd, my parents lingered, their faces uncertain. Claire remained seated, conferring with her attorney, her mask cracked but not broken. I turned away from them and toward the people who had stood by me all along. For the first time, I felt the weight of Ruth's words, fully connection will outlast power. Outside sunlight broke through clouds that had threatened rain all morning. The tenants gathered around me on the courthouse steps, their relief as visible as my own. But even as I breathed in that moment, I knew Claire's fight was not finished, and I knew mine wasn't either. The courthouse steps were still crowded when I walked away with Edith at my side. The tenants surrounded us, their voices buzzing with relief, but I could feel in my bones that the matter wasn't over. Claire would not accept the ruling quietly. For 3 days, I allowed myself the smallest pause, checking on tenants and reassuring them that nothing would change. But then Walter called again, his tone brisk. "She'll regroup," he warned. "We need to prepare for what comes next." He was right. My sense of victory had already begun to harden into resolve. I spent long hours at Walter's office, the air smelling of old wood and coffee, as we stacked file after file across his desk. He urged me to think like Claire would, to anticipate every argument she might raise. I began charting the finances into neat spreadsheets, each number showing where repairs had been promised but never made. The more I worked, the clearer the pattern became. She had not simply been careless, she had used Maple Terrace as a source of income for herself, siphoning money from people who trusted her. Walter pointed to one ledger entry after another. "These transfers aren't just bad optics," he said. "They could be considered fraud." His words sank deep. I typed late into the night, Ruth's leather journal open beside me, her notes guiding me. Each page of her script reminded me she had foreseen this, leaving me not only the building, but also the tools to defend it. Edith came the next morning with a thick folder under her arm. She set it on my table with a steady hand. Inside were tenant statements signed and dated describing conversations with Claire, ignored calls for help, and unexplained rent increases. 15 tenants were willing to write, she said. More will testify if needed. I thanked her and she smiled gently. Your grandmother always said the truth lives in the details. Now you have them. Her support steadied me more than I could admit. That afternoon I walked the building with my phone photographing cracked tiles in the lobby, water stains on the ceiling, and rusted pipes that should have been replaced years ago. The images joined the spreadsheets, each one more proof of the neglect tenants had endured. By evening, my table was covered in evidence, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt sharper, more focused than before. The next day the doorbell rang, and when I opened it, my parents stood there again. My mother's pearls gleamed as always, but her eyes held impatience. She stepped inside without asking, her voice sharp. Nora, what are you doing? Claire has always protected this family, and now you're dragging us into court battles. My father stayed near the door, his hands deep in his pockets, his voice low but firm. You're threatening everything your grandmother built, he said. I looked at them, then at the papers spread across my table. Did she tell you, I asked quietly, that she diverted over $80,000 meant for repairs into her own accounts? My mother's eyes flickered before she looked away. Business is complicated, she said. Your sister understands these things better than you ever will. The words were familiar, heavy with years of repetition. My father's silence was confirmation enough. They left without looking back, saying they would pray I came to my senses. I stood in the empty apartment, the smell of tea still lingering from Edith's visit, and felt the old ache of being dismissed. Yet this time, it didn't unsteady me. The files in front of me, Ruth's careful handwriting, Edith's unwavering loyalty, all of it reminded me I wasn't alone. Walter arrived the following morning carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He placed one on the table and glanced at the 3 neat stacks I had made overnight. Financial misconduct here, I explained, pointing to the first. Tenant statements here, ownership and transfer documents in the last stack. He nodded with approval. You're ready, he said simply. I ran my hand along the edge of Ruth's notes, reading the words she had left me. She had never written about profits or expansion. She had written about roofs that didn't leak, hallways that felt safe, tenants who trusted their home would be theirs tomorrow. Claire had always seen property as numbers. Ruth, and now I saw people. That afternoon, Edith called, her voice tense. Someone from Claire's firm served me papers, she said. They're claiming I'm violating policy by organizing tenant meetings. My hand clenched around the phone. I wanted to confront Claire immediately, but Walter, reading the message over my shoulder, shook his head. That's what she wants. Don't give her a chance to see your strategy. Still, the anger burned. Edith's calm voice soothed me. Don't worry about me, she said. I've seen worse. Just keep to the plan. That's what Ruth would tell you. Her steadiness gave me back my breath. That night, Walter and I drafted protections for vulnerable tenants, especially the elderly, and those living on fixed incomes. Each plan we wrote was one more barrier between Claire and the people she sought to uproot. I worked until my eyes burned, but when I finally leaned back, I felt prepared in a way I never had before. Before leaving, Walter looked at me across the table. Your sister thinks this is about property. You know it's about people. That's why you'll succeed. His voice carried no doubt. When I walked back to Maple Terrace, Edith was waiting on her porch. She held her teapot in both hands, her silver hair glowing under the porch light. You're ready, she said simply as I climbed the steps. I thought of Ruth then, of every quiet lesson she had left me. I nodded, the weight of the past weeks settling into something stronger. Monday would bring another challenge, and Claire would surely strike again. But for the first time, I felt not just prepared, I felt steady enough to meet her. The morning sun had barely risen when Walter called again. His voice carried a sharp edge I had not heard before. "She's filed a new motion," he said. "This time, she's going after Harbor Lane itself." I pressed the phone tighter against my ear as he explained. Claire was arguing that Ruth had been under undue influence, that I had manipulated her into creating the LLC. Worse, she had secured a press interview painting herself as the guardian of family tradition. By noon, the local paper had printed her picture again, my parents standing dutifully at her side. Their words were familiar. "We only want what's best for both our daughters," but they landed differently now, heavy with the knowledge that they would never see me clearly. I set the paper down and stared at the headline. Edith called moments later, her voice low but firm. "The tenants know the truth," she said. "Don't let the noise rattle you." Her certainty steadied me, but I felt the walls closing in all the same. That evening, my parents appeared at my door once more. My father's expression was carved from stone, my mother's voice brittle with rehearsed compassion. "This rebellion has gone far enough," she said. "Claire knows how to manage. You're making yourself look foolish." My father's hand rested on my shoulder the way it had when I was a child, heavy with expectation. "Be reasonable," he urged. I led them to the table where the documents were spread in neat stacks: financial transfers, tenant statements, Ruth's clear handwriting on page after page. "Did she tell you about the $80,000? I asked. My mother's gaze slipped away, her silence louder than any answer. They left soon after, promising again to pray. I came to my senses. The door clicked shut, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than their words. I walked across the courtyard to Edith's apartment. Her porch light was on as always, the signal she was awake. She poured tea into her mother's floral cups while I explained Walter's warning. She listened, then reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Eleanor anticipated this," she said, using Ruth's name softly. "She left you more than you realize. Tomorrow the tenants will be at court. They'll speak for her and for you." By the time I returned to my apartment, Walter was waiting with boxes of records. Together we laid them out on the floor, each file marked and labeled. 3 tenants stopped by that night carrying signed statements. Each one described conversations with Ruth in her final years, her clarity, her plans for Maple Terrace, her insistence that it remain affordable. Their words built a picture more vivid than any legal argument. The night stretched long. Walter drilled me again on my testimony, patient but firm, while Edith sat nearby with her knitting. The steady click of her needles calmed me in a way nothing else could. Near midnight, I pulled an old photo from the album Ruth and I on the rooftop garden. The city stretched behind us, her arm firm around my shoulders. I studied her smile, remembering the strength in her voice, even in her final months. "I hope I make you proud," I whispered. Morning came too quickly. The courthouse steps were crowded before I arrived. Tenants filled the benches inside, their faces lined with determination. Lila sat with her cane resting against the pew, Manny stood tall near the back, and the Johnsons clasped hands as if bracing together. Edith settled beside me, her presence steady. Across the aisle, Claire sat rigid in her suit, her attorney flipping through papers with deliberate precision. My parents took their place behind her, my father's arm protective around my mother. When the judge entered the room, stilled. Claire's attorney rose first, his voice practiced and commanding. He painted Ruth as frail, confused, easily swayed. He spoke of prescriptions of age of influence. Each word twisted my grandmother into someone I barely recognized. My chest tightened, but I kept my eyes forward, remembering Edith's words about patience. When Walter stood, his calm steadied the room. He spoke of his 34 years as Ruth's counsel, her sharp mind, her careful preparation. Then he placed a tablet on the desk and pressed play. Ruth's face filled the screen. The date marked 3 weeks before her passing. Her voice, though softened with age, carried no hesitation. "I, Ruth Bennett, being of sound mind and body, make this statement freely and without coercion." She spoke of Maple Terrace, of the families who had called it home, of why she trusted me to continue her work. Silence filled the courtroom when the video ended. Walter handed up medical evaluations confirming Ruth's sound judgment records signed by her physician. He presented financial ledgers showing Claire's diversions, the $80,000 taken from maintenance funds. Then Edith rose with her folder, her voice steady despite the weight of the room. She spoke of broken heat in winter, of sick tenants, of promises Ruth had made to protect them. Her words fell like stones in still water, each one undeniable. Finally, the judge turned to me. "Miss Bennett, why should you retain control of Maple Terrace?" The walk to the witness stand felt endless. I swore the oath and sat my heart hammering. I spoke carefully, explaining that I wasn't seeking punishment, but protection. I described managing daily operations for years, knowing every corner of the building, every tenant by name. I spoke of Ruth's lessons of keeping records, of seeing homes instead of numbers. Claire's attorney pressed me hard, testing my knowledge of finances, but Walter had prepared me well. Each question had an answer, each accusation a document in reply. When the questioning ended, the judge asked for closing statements. Claire's attorney emphasized her credentials, her years of managing assets, the family's financial interests. Walter countered with Ruth's intent, her clarity, and the harm done under Claire's watch. The judge reviewed her notes in silence, the room holding its breath. At last, she looked up. She ruled that Ruth had acted with full competence, that Harbor Lane was valid, and that my ownership stood. She ordered a full accounting of Claire's management and repayment of misused funds. Claire's shoulders sank, her polished mask faltering. The gavel struck the sound, echoing through the chamber. Relief swept through me, through Edith, through every tenant gathered there. On the courthouse steps, the sun broke through clouds that had hung low all morning. Tenants surrounded me, their gratitude filling the air. Walter placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice steady. She knew what she was doing, and now so do you. But as I looked across the crowd, I saw Claire conferring with her attorney, her face set. She would not retreat easily. The fight was far from finished, and I knew it. The week following the ruling moved in a blur. Tenants gathered in the lobby almost nightly, their relief echoing in the way they laughed and lingered. For the first time in months, Maple Terrace felt light again. Edith oversaw plans for the community room renovation, Lila brought out her cookie tins, and Manny volunteered to repair benches in the courtyard. Their hope became my anchor. But Walter reminded me daily that Claire was not finished. "She'll appeal," he warned, laying another folder on his desk. "Expect it. She may already be gathering new allies." His voice carried calm assurance, but his eyes betrayed the weariness of years in courtrooms. I nodded, already feeling the truth of his words, in the silence from my parents' side of the family. On Thursday evening, as I walked through the building with a clipboard in hand, Manny intercepted me in the hallway. "Saw someone from Claire's firm snooping around," he muttered. "Asking tenants about maintenance, pretending to be a surveyor." I thanked him and noted it, the unease curling in my stomach. Claire wasn't just fighting in court, she was trying to unsettle the people who had stood by me. That weekend, Edith stopped by with another sealed envelope. "This came to my mailbox by mistake," she said. My name was written in Ruth's careful script. Inside was a single sheet folded neatly. "When pressure rises, remember, connection will hold where power slips." I traced the familiar handwriting, my throat tight. Even now, Ruth's words seemed to appear exactly when I needed them. On Sunday afternoon, the family met again at my parents' home. Claire stood at the head of the table, her tone sharp as she outlined her appeal. "The judge may have ruled, but this isn't over," she declared. My parents nodded in unison as though her words were gospel. I stayed silent until she turned her eyes on me. "You can still step aside gracefully, Nora. Spare everyone the spectacle." Walter, seated beside me, cleared his throat. "Or you can prepare for an accounting," he said evenly. He laid out ledgers, showing Claire's diversions. Amy, my cousin, leaned forward, scanning the numbers. "These transfers don't add up," she murmured. For the first time, Claire's face faltered. The room filled with murmurs as relatives exchanged uncertain looks. When the meeting broke, Edith and I walked to the car together. "She's unraveling," Edith said softly. "But be careful. Desperation makes people reckless." I looked back at the house Claire framed in the window, her arms folded tight across her chest. Her fight wasn't about to end. By midweek, another letter arrived, this time from the county clerk. Claire had indeed filed an appeal challenging the repayment order. Walter and I reviewed every page late into the night, the lamp on his desk burning past midnight. He emphasized each clause, each potential weak point, while I compiled new statements from tenants. The work felt endless, but it steadied me. That Friday, as I left the courthouse after filing our response, I saw Claire on the steps. Her expression was unreadable, her posture rigid, but her voice carried venom when she spoke. "You've embarrassed this family long enough," she said. "I won't let you drag us all down." I met her gaze, the noise of downtown traffic filling the silence between us. For once, I didn't feel small in her presence. Back at Maple Terrace, Edith waited in the lobby, her knitting needles tucked into her bag. She listened as I recounted the exchange, then shook her head. "She doesn't see what we see," she said. "But the court will." I nodded, letting her words ground me, even as unease lingered. The appeal would come soon, and with it, the final test of Ruth's planning, my endurance, and the tenants' trust. I knew we were moving toward the true breaking point. The appeal hearing came and went faster than I expected. Claire walked into the courtroom with the same confidence she had carried all her life, but this time it didn't hold. The judge reviewed the files we had gathered, the testimony from tenants, and Ruth's video statement. In the end, the ruling stood. My ownership of Maple Terrace was upheld, and Claire was ordered to repay what she had taken. She kept her expression composed, but her eyes betrayed the truth she knew she had lost. Outside, the tenants crowded around me. Manny clapped me on the back. Lila squeezed my hand, and Edith leaned in with tears of relief in her eyes. "She'd be proud of you," she whispered. I believed her. For the first time, I felt like Ruth's trust had been fully honored. Claire disappeared from the courthouse quickly, her heels clicking down the marble steps, until she was swallowed by the crowd. In the weeks that followed, her law firm quietly placed her on leave. Rumors reached me that she had taken a small position at another firm far from the spotlight she once craved. My parents called only sparingly, their words careful, tinged with uncertainty. For them, the lines had blurred between loyalty and truth. And though we still spoke, there was a distance now that might never close completely. Life at Maple Terrace, however, shifted in ways I hadn't imagined. We unveiled the new community room, dedicating it to Ruth, with a plaque that read, "Where neighbors become family." Edith organized monthly potlucks. Manny led small repair workshops, and children filled the courtyard with their laughter again. The building was no longer just housing, it was what Ruth had always intended it to be, a place of belonging. One afternoon, as I reviewed applications for our new housing assistance program, Edith placed a fresh pot of tea on my desk. She smiled knowingly and said, "You've turned this building into a home, Nora. That's a rare thing." I thought back to the girl I had been when Claire first stood in my doorway with that notice. I hardly recognized her anymore. Months passed, and even my parents began to soften. They attended one of our gatherings, standing awkwardly by the dessert table, while tenants offered them cookies and conversation. We didn't resolve everything that night, but the silence between us finally gave way to small words, tentative but genuine. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. 1 year later, I stood on the rooftop garden at sunset, the same spot where Ruth and I had once watched the city glow. The air carried the scent of fresh paint from newly renovated hallways, mixed with the familiar aroma of Edith's cinnamon cookies wafting up from below. I closed my eyes and let the evening breeze carry Ruth's voice back to me. Power without compassion is just control. Connection lasts longer than any victory. The lesson had become my compass. I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because Ruth had prepared me to see people first, to choose connection over control, even when it was harder to stand alone. As the last light faded from the sky, I thought about Claire. I wondered if in time she might come to see what Ruth had always known. But whether she did or not, I had made peace with the path I was on. Maple Terrace wasn't just my inheritance, it was my purpose. And so when I walked back down into the courtyard, greeted by tenants who now felt like family, I knew that this was the real victory. Not the courtroom ruling, not the repayment order, but the community Ruth had entrusted me to protect. That was the legacy worth carrying forward. Before I close this chapter, I'll leave you with this. Life has a way of showing us who people really are, but it also gives us the chance to choose who we will be in return. If this story touched you, take a moment to share where you're listening from and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. And maybe tonight think about the legacy you're building, not with money or power, but with kindness, with fairness, and with connection. That in the end is what lasts.